This episode is brought to you by my book, The Skeptical Buddha, The Tao of Science, a coffee table-style book that discusses the history of Eastern philosophy and where it complements and diverges from science and skepticism. More about this at the end of the video. Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. After the horrors of World War I caused by fascists in the beginning of the Cold War, seeing how horrible Stalin was to his people, many people in government who had been sympathetic to socialist causes began to shift their stances to what they viewed as a more middle ground. It also didn't help that a full-on witch hunt in the House Un-American Activities Committee could make you lose your job in government if you even looked a little pink to them. From there came what became to be known as the liberal consensus. One of the things I failed to understand about the term proletariat for the longest time is that it did not necessarily refer to the working class as we know it. It referred to a class of people who essentially owned nothing but the clothes on their backs and their children, and that was assuming their debts didn't make their clothes not even something they owned. They had pretty much no stake in the current system and acted as wage slaves who never saw things getting better, with little opportunities beyond the next paycheck. Marx assumed that once this proletariat class naturally became the majority with mass industrialization, the collective will and overwhelming voting power would create a dictatorship of the proletariat, ending the bourgeois revolution from the monarchy and ushering in the proletariat revolution that would lead to some form of direct democracy anarcho-socialism. But this proletariat revolution never came in the Western world. Why? Because the bourgeois at the time had read their Marx and realized that the best way to kill the proletariat revolution was to convert a large enough majority to petite bourgeois or middle class, that their votes canceled out the proletariat. They did this through essentially social democracy and social liberalism. Give enough people property and a stake in ownership, and they won't dream of voting socialist, especially if you can isolate them from the other classes. They did this by halting but allowing 1/3 of all jobs to be union job, with limited powers via the Taft-Hartley Act, which is why if many think unions are useless in the US, they relatively kind of are because they were broken on purpose by the Republican Party. No other nation has our wimpy unions as in the US except for maybe Australia, and Taft-Hartley is used as a warning to the rest of the unions of the world as to what can happen if you let government remove union rights. So unions were allowed to continue to exist, but often corrupt or in bed with the mob, because they were the only ones with the muscle to give these anemic unions any teeth. With the unions crippled, they could stay the same size but never grow. This turned union members into their own class and created enmity between the union and non-union working class. After that, they began to heap benefits onto mostly the class they decided they needed to go after, white men. The Montgomery GI Bill, affordable government housing veterans involving well-built housing mostly in the suburbs with laws that you couldn't sell to any minority. On average, the bourgeois vote classical liberal, the middle class vote social liberal, while the proletariat vote leftist. There are variations, of course, from nation to nation. Religion can make an impact on making someone with more proclivities to be more leftist to be more conservative depending on the type. Good education can provide empathy and class consciousness for someone more likely to be more conservative to move more left. But I do believe Marx was right on this, and the liberal consensus made that possible. They could maintain the underclass, but basically pay the middle class enough to be conservative enough so there would never be a revolution. And how did the rich fund this payment to the middle class? Through their own profits? Oh heck no, they did it by exploiting other nations, wars, trade embargoes, unfair trade deals, treating the banana republics as their own feudal kingdoms, where American investors owned 90% of the land and the citizens acted as their serfs. They did it by overthrowing elected leaders through coups if they dared cut into profits or redistribute unused land to their citizens. They also exploited the very poor, making it really expensive to be poor because there was no one to stand up for them and their rights. Minorities had ridiculous credit rates, and banks ensured that their property values would drop if a minority moved into their area, creating artificial enmity between whites and minorities for ruining their neighborhood, when it was the banks and redlining that ruined their neighborhood and artificially lowered the values of their home, which created white flight because they didn't want to be the last white person in a game of musical chairs with a house that was worth a fraction of the value of what it was before desegregation, just because banks decided it was worthless. With a lower tax base, lower amenities and poorer schools were created, making the minority neighborhoods being just naturally worse, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once the Fair Housing Act was passed under Johnson and minorities were finally allowed to live in those white neighborhoods, Realtors would use predatory blockbusting that was unfair to both whites and blacks, scaring white people to sell quickly and move out for lower than the house was worth, then sell to minorities at artificially high prices in the now depressed area. From Nixon to George W. Bush, the prison population went from half the population per person of the post-Stalin Soviet Union to double that of the Soviet Union. China has 2/3 the prison population per person in the US, so if they rightly are a police state, what the heck does that make us? But once again, that was the cause of the segregation of the middle class from the proletariat, which the middle class, who were mostly all white, and made that way because of their race, had little sympathy or unaware of just how different their opportunities were. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, suddenly the US business interests believed there was no reason to put policies in place to juxtapose them with the Stalinist states, and many just forgot about Marx and his predictions about the proletariat, and began to carve up the middle class with globalist trade, gutting the middle class the liberal consensus had worked so hard to maintain, and more began slipping into the proletariat class. Once many of us fell into the proletariat class where we own nothing, or perhaps even less than nothing thanks to debt, mostly student debt, many of us began to realize that we had a lot more in common with the other proletariat minorities than we did with the bourgeois than we ever would have had we stayed in the middle class. This was their error. Wokeism really is largely caused by so many of us falling into the proletariat class. The never-ending barrage of new charges and fees they keep trying to dump on us as rent-seeking. We own our cars, but we don't actually own them. They belong to the mechanic, especially as you try and buy more hybrid or electric cars because the dealer has a monopoly on most repairs. The same is true with phones and other planned obsolescence tech. One can tell just how tone-deaf and unaware of their marks they are when it was stated in Davos, "You will own nothing and you will be happy," like that was a good thing they were giving us, oblivious to the fact that ownership was one of the biggest things that kept America from going socialist. Rent-seeking raises its head more and more. Price gouging, masking itself as inflation, continues to rise, which forces up interest rates, making it even more impossible to get out of debt. And I have to constantly tell myself I am one of the lucky ones. I can't imagine how I could get by with kids and no degree. I made all the good risks I was supposed to take to better myself, and yet I own nothing but debt and am pissed off. I walked right out of college into the beginning of the recession, and had undiagnosed ADHD along with an autism spectrum disorder, and I've been underpaid ever since. Every single time I worked my ass off to go through the abusive process of changing jobs to finally make closer to what I'm worth, I then expect my debt to go down. But either inflation goes up or the interest rates go up. Everything just feels like a death by 1,000 cuts, and I'm lucky as I don't have to worry about the police shooting me because I'm scary, and have the VA take care of my healthcare for free. I see just how lucky I am, yet how much I'm struggling, and can't even begin to imagine how people with my advantages aren't all living in a cardboard box at the moment. It's been uncovered that landlords have been colluding with each other online to purposely keep housing units off the market, so the prices of rent go up artificially, and they bargain collectively to raise rents overall. This benefits those who already own a home, as the value of the houses keep going up, but those without keep getting squeezed more and more and end up homeless, meaning that a person with a home is benefiting from people being homeless, thanks to the forced scarcity, and they don't even know it, completely oblivious that those two things are even remotely affected. Sadly, because there is such a tiny safety net because they were able to other the proletariat from the middle class, they were able to view poverty as a moral failing and therefore allowed the politicians to gut anything that could help you get back on top, instead of attacking upward. Many who were slipping downward in this decade from their middle class, or even just felt like it could go away, became increasingly more and more fear-based in reaction to the hollowing out of the middle class, and populists were able to distract their hate and fear at literally anyone but the wealthy, who orchestrated all of this, just like what happened in the late Weimar Republic. Fear of loss of their ownership or lowering of property value, which will be essential to getting rid of homelessness, is insanely scary to the middle class. I remember growing up being told that the poverty of reparations from World War I is what led to the rise of Hitler. This is only partly true. It boosted the ranks of the proletariat class, which increased high levels of leftists in Germany. This scared the middle class and saw National Socialism as an option to keep the leftists down, as it became a cult of calling anything I don't like communism, which is the greatest Jew evil ever. It's why Hitler never got more than 1/3 of the vote. The rich were voting conservative and the poor were voting socialist or communist. This led to infighting and snap elections that caused 3 general elections in 1 year, and after enough fatigue led to many not showing up to vote, leading to the Nazis winning enough seats that the conservatives believed they could control Hitler until that turned out to be too late. Oddly enough, that's how Netanyahu was able to become prime minister while fighting criminal charges. Fascism is referred to as capitalism in decay for a reason. The middle class view people under them as failing morally, but when they start to fail financially, they blame anyone but themselves, including those who have the least power, and fascist leaders are more than happy to exploit that. The only reason America and the West were able to succeed without falling into fascism again was because the rich had read their Marx and kept enough people in the middle class that they didn't have to worry about socialism. They instead made their money by exploiting people who couldn't vote, such as in other nations, or couldn't vote in large enough numbers because they were made to be the underclass to look down on by the majority of voters. Fascists are always a check on leftist revolutions on purpose, which is why so many of the rich are embracing fascism daily, even as the rest of us get more and more radicalized, or, as in the case of the US, nearly 1/3 has just dropped out of dealing with voting at all because it's all the same to them. It's possible one of the major differences is when you thought you were middle class, but weren't really, versus actually being middle class and getting squeezed, that decides if you're going to radicalize leftist or far right as capitalism decays. But what level of empathy and engagement you have with your own level of privilege versus those who moralize poverty, and God is blessing me, so I must be doing good. Social liberalism and social democracy are good middle grounds, if you can convince people that Stalin and Pol Pot represent all of leftism, and therefore just as evil as Nazis. This will lead to rising incomes, government-funded research, better roads and highways, and at the same time, apathy about politics and care about those suffering exploitation overseas until they suddenly get squeezed and most often radicalized to the far right. However, they only delay the next generation of rich people picking the nation's carcass clean of scraps, leading to another rise of leftism and fascism and renewed violence, and avoid the fact that an economic and social underclass, either domestically or abroad, is required to make this still profitable to the rich. Want to end socialist movements? Kill the proletariat class by giving them property and a stake in the economy. Or I guess just kill them by, making housing, food, and healthcare unaffordable, or starting a civil war between the fascists and the left and center-left. But all that does is destabilize true growth versus short-term profits, which at this point is all the rich really care about anyway. This episode is brought to you by The Skeptical Buddha, The Tao of Science, my book, which is a thoughtful discourse on Eastern philosophy and how it helped birth ideas required for science and skepticism and the way it fell behind in the face of new evidence. This book discusses the long history of both philosophies as well as the tenets and variations within the varying sects, along with psychology and our own natural biases. It discusses how to counter our natural biases using science and the underlying concepts of meditation and mindfulness, a more complex understanding of how science operates than most of the public understands, and why it is the best tool we have to discover truth and reality, as well as philosophical ideas we might embrace as technology progresses. The material is packaged in a way that the average person can understand, with rich illustrations to draw the reader in and feel at peace. So as always, thank you all for watching this as a video or listening to this as a podcast, which I'm sure was completely uncontroversial to anyone, especially to the YouTube monetization team. So if you found this useful, please donate to my Patreon. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis 2814 on YouTube, and I have almost 700 videos on my channel that I've made over the past 11 years on religion, science, psychology, and politics. Please go check them out, and if your site has the option, like, rate, review, and comment. A special thanks goes out to Kendall Copperberg, Mylon Mia, Ogrel, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Joe Taylor for their $10 or more Wapawet level donations. I'm always humbled by the fact that they find my work worth funding and worth driving me forward. Thank you all. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.